Frogs, newts, and salamanders are in trouble. They have thin, permeable skins, making them extra sensitive to heat and light from the sun. Even small increases in temperature can harm their ability to breed, scientists are finding. To learn more about the effects of climate change on amphibians in the Pacific Northwest, OSU graduate student Lindsey Thurman is studying their health and habitats.
So we're out here at Woodpecker Loop Pond at Finley Wildlife Refuge south of Corvallis. And this is a great forested pond for finding amphibians. So a biologist's toolbox is really important for effective sampling in aquatic conditions. In the wintertime, my most important piece of gear are these neoprene gloves. And this keeps my hands from basically becoming icicles. These small aquarium nets are useful for larvae and eggs. And we also bring dip nets and sometimes even seines when we're looking at larger, more mobile individuals. For collecting data, a write in the rain is imperative. It's waterproof paper. So in rainy conditions, when you're sampling in the pond even, you can still write even if it's soaking wet. I always bring a field guide with me, and along with my field guide, I like to bring these staging tables of frogs and salamanders so that I can get a good idea of what developmental stage I'm looking at and compare it to each of the species in the book. We also use various size bottles for collecting specimens if we're doing that. This is a good size for collecting small eggs. And then my trusty waterproof bag. So I find it kind of ironic sometimes that I'm out sampling in water, but everything else has to be waterproof. If you look behind me, there's an upland forest area where many amphibians will stay when they're not breeding here in the pond. So right now it's kind of the early part of the season, and we're likely to see some of the newts and salamanders out here in early stages of breeding. So what I like to do is first take a walk around the perimeter of the pond and just kind of get an idea for the community in this pond. So I'm going to start looking for salamanders and newts. You know, when we first walked in here, we heard things kind of jumping into the pond. So I'm curious as to what that was. Oftentimes it's just as useful to use your ears as it is your eyes, especially for frogs if they're calling. Usually when you hear frogs croaking, it's either chorus frogs or, unfortunately, oftentimes it's the American bullfrog, because they congregate in huge numbers and just make all sorts of noise.
In Oregon, the American bullfrog is an invasive species. They were introduced to the Pacific Northwest in the 1930s when frog legs were a culinary delicacy. After frog legs went out of fashion on dinner menus, breeders released the animals into the wild. Now, bullfrogs are worrisome pests.
The American bullfrog is having a huge impact on our native amphibians. They're a gape-limited predator, and they're very large, so they can eat pretty much whatever they can fit in their mouth. And they've had a pretty bad impact on our wetland communities here in the valley, not just amphibians, but other prey, and they compete with fish and amphibians for resources, so we're not too fond of them.
Biologists at Finley Wildlife Refuge have been removing invasive bullfrogs from ponds for many years to allow native species like the red-legged frog and the rough-skinned newt to survive. Lindsey is discovering that native amphibians seem to be doing quite well at Finley.
And even though the water is freezing, there's one. That was pretty easy. So this is a male rough-skinned newt. And right now, he and all of his male friends are out here establishing their territory so that the females can come out and breed and lay their eggs. Rough-skinned newts are really interesting because they have this thing called an Unken reflex. It's also called posturing. So if you can see their bright orange bellies, that's a predator defense strategy. So one of their common predators is the garter snake, and when they are attacked or almost attacked by the predator, they will stick their chins up and wave around their bright orange bellies. And this is a good indicator that they're toxic, which they are. They have tetrodotoxin, which is a neurotoxin, And that's another reason I'll be washing my hands after this.
Lindsey looks for the eggs of the rough-skinned newt, but says they're hard to spot.
They often look like little marbles. So you have to have a really keen eye for finding their eggs. They're not as conspicuous as most of the frog egg masses, which are laid in kind of these softball-sized jelly masses. So we'll just keep going around the perimeter, see if we find any more adults, and maybe come across some frog eggs. When I'm sampling for amphibians, I use polarized sunglasses to help me look into the water. And this is especially useful in these murkier ponds down here in the valley. It allows you to look deeper into the water and get a better idea of the complexity of the substrate and the amphibians that are down there. But it's this beautiful, large, almost cantaloupe-sized egg mass. And it's attached to this vegetation. Just hundreds of little embryos. Here it is at the surface. Squishy. They're actually extremely durable, which is surprising. You'd think they would just fall apart. But what's one distinguishing feature of this is that it's not a solid ball of eggs. It's actually, you can almost distinguish between each egg and their jelly coat. This is just a beautiful egg mass. Just awesome. And they're really early stage, so these were recently laid. And they'll grow in their jelly for a couple weeks and then emerge as larvae and be free swimming and probably stay in the shallows.
Lindsey is finishing up her master's degree at OSU and will soon start work on her PhD.
When I started looking into graduate school, I paid close attention to the schools that were highest ranked for fisheries and wildlife, and OSU was, of course, my top choice. So when it comes to climate change, one of the things we're most concerned about is increasing temperatures. And so for amphibians, that means that their ponds may not be suitable for breeding.
Rising temperatures aren't the only climate-related threat facing amphibians. They are also sensitive to ultraviolet light. Most of Lindsey's current research focuses on high-elevation species in the Cascades mountain range, where UV light is especially intense.
So this is our UV radiometer. It allows us to measure ultraviolet light in the pond. So you can take measurements at the surface, and then you can take measurements all the way down to the bottom of the pond. And one of the most important readings we can take is the amount of UV light these embryos are getting. Because we know that UV is impacted embryos and can cause death and other forms of mutations, we want to know how much UV light is reaching these eggs. You know, it's interesting too that, like this red-legged frog, they seem to find the same breeding spots each year, especially if it's quality habitat like this. And so from what I remember last year, these red-legged frogs are breeding almost in the same exact location, which is great for conservation and also great that they have habitat to come back to every year.